In the year 1206, a man who had once been a hunted outcast rose to claim the title of Genghis Khan, universal ruler. His birth name was Temujin, a boy who grew up on the harsh Mongolian steppe, where life was a constant battle against hunger, cold, and betrayal. By sheer force of will, ruthless cunning, and a vision larger than the endless horizon, he united the scattered and warring tribes of the steppe under a single banner. But what he forged that year was not just an empire in the making. It was a weapon more terrible than any sword, bow, or cavalry charge. Genghis Khan understood something that other conquerors had overlooked. Fear travels faster than armies. Terror spreads further than arrows. And the human imagination, once poisoned with horror, becomes its own executioner. The tribes that bent the knee to him did not do so merely because of military strength. They surrendered because Temujin wielded fear like a blacksmith wields iron, shaping it, sharpening it, making it stronger with each conquest. His enemies saw not only a warlord, but the shadow of something larger, a force of inevitability that whispered of fates worse than death. The Mongol horde thundered across the plains, their hooves shaking the earth, their arrows darkening the sky. Yet it wasn't their weapons alone that broke kingdoms. It was the stories that raced ahead of them, of cities burned to the ground, of captives crushed beneath wooden platforms while Mongol generals feasted above, of entire families slaughtered so that survivors would carry the memory forever. Each tale grew more terrifying as it spread along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and pilgrims. By the time the Mongols reached a city's gates, the psychological battle was often already won. For Temujin, cruelty was never random. It was deliberate, calculated with chilling precision. Where others might massacre in vengeance or fury, he did so with purpose, as part of a strategy designed to strip resistance before the first arrow was loosed. Those who surrendered quickly were often spared, allowed to live and pay tribute. But those who resisted learned that the price was not just death. It was a death crafted to be so unbearable, so grotesque, that surrender would always seem the saner choice. And so, in 1206, a new empire was born, not merely of warriors and horses, but of nightmares. Genghis Khan had discovered that terror itself could be systematized, refined, and unleashed upon the world. From that moment forward, fear was no longer an accident of war. Under his command, it became the very foundation of empire. Every empire is built on laws, but few were as merciless as those of the Mongols. At the heart of Genghis Khan's war machine lay the yasa, a code that was less a set of rules and more a blueprint for domination. It did not merely regulate behavior. It transformed discipline into a weapon as sharp as any blade. The yasa decreed that loyalty was absolute, that unity was survival, and that failure would be punished not just individually, but collectively. One soldier who fled the battlefield doomed not only himself but his entire unit of 10. If a unit of 10 faltered, all 100 were executed. If a company of 100 broke, an entire 1,000 would be erased. This was no idle threat. The Mongols enforced it without hesitation, leaving behind fields littered not with the bodies of enemies, but of their own who had shown weakness. This system created a web of mutual surveillance where every warrior became his brother's keeper and his brother's executioner. No man dared run. For his friends, his kin, his blood would be dragged down with him. The effect was chilling. An army where desertion was unthinkable, where fear of the Khan's justice burned hotter than fear of the enemy's sword. Yet the yasa's punishments were not confined to the battlefield. Thieves lost more than their spoils. First offense meant a broken bone, second offense another, third offense, death. Adulterers were executed. Spies faced strangulation or arrows in the chest. These were not secret sentences carried out in the shadows. Punishments were public, staged as spectacles of terror. Entire units were ordered to witness, sometimes even to participate in, the breaking of their comrades. To refuse was itself a capital crime. In this way, the yasa bled into every corner of Mongol life, binding society with a fear so pervasive it became second nature. Children grew up watching their fathers enforce the code, knowing that hesitation meant ruin. Women, elders, and chieftains alike understood that the Khan's law was merciless and inescapable. It was discipline weaponized, cruelty refined into order. Other armies fought with swords and arrows, but the Mongols fought with a system that fused survival and terror into one. Every soldier carried not just a bow, but the knowledge that one moment of weakness would cost his entire unit their lives. And so, under the shadow of the Yasa, Genghis Khan created something unprecedented. A military force where loyalty was not a choice but a sentence, where obedience was not inspired by honor, but carved into flesh and bone. Discipline became horror, and horror became empire. To the Mongols, blood was not merely fluid, it was the vessel of the soul. To spill it carelessly was to desecrate something sacred. Yet this belief did not spare their enemies from torment. Instead, it inspired a cruelty that was paradoxically more horrific. For in their determination to avoid bloodshed, the Mongols perfected methods of killing that prolonged agony and carved terror into memory. One of their most infamous punishments was the crushing platform. Captured nobles and princes were bound and laid flat on the ground. Over them, a heavy wooden board was placed. Then, in a grotesque display of contempt, Mongol generals feasted on top of the platform, laughing and drinking while their enemies suffocated and were slowly ground to death beneath their weight. Witnesses described the muffled screams, the trembling of the wood, and the horror etched on the faces of those forced to watch. Death came not with a sword stroke, but with humiliation that lasted hours. Another method was the rawhide sack. Victims were stripped and bound tightly in freshly cut animal skins. Then they were left beneath the blazing sun. As the hide dried, it shrank and constricted, crushing their bodies inch by inch. The suffering could last for days, every breath a battle, every moment a tightening vice. When the sack finally silenced its prisoner, the shriveled corpse stood as a grim testament to Mongol ingenuity in cruelty. The carpet execution was perhaps the most symbolic. When Baghdad fell, the last Abbasid caliph was rolled into a rug. Mongol horses were then driven over him, their hooves pounding until his body broke. No blood was spilled, but the message was unmistakable. Even rulers blessed by religion and empire could be trampled like dirt. It was a death staged not just for its victim, but for history itself. What made these methods so terrifying was not only their pain, but their theater. Families were often forced to watch. Sons knelt as their fathers were crushed beneath feasting boards. Wives wept as their husbands suffocated in sacks. These were not executions meant to punish one man. They were rituals designed to shatter entire bloodlines. Survivors carried the trauma for generations, spreading tales that magnified Mongol terror across continents. In this way, the Mongols twisted their own beliefs into weapons. By avoiding the spilling of blood, they convinced themselves they honored the soul. But in reality, they ensured that death itself became a spectacle of suffering, a tool of conquest sharper than any blade. The world had seen brutality before, but under Genghis Khan, cruelty was refined into ritual and ritual into empire. The Mongols understood that to break a man's body was not enough. To truly shatter resistance, one had to break the spirit of his bloodline. And so they turned families into unwilling participants in a theater of cruelty, ensuring that terror would not die with the victim, but would echo for generations. Fathers were not simply executed. Their sons were forced to kneel beside them, to watch as the men who had once been their protectors were crushed, suffocated, or trampled beneath horses. Imagine a boy, trembling in the dust, his wide eyes fixed on his father's contorted face as life ebbed away, while Mongol soldiers stood over him with cold expressions, ensuring he did not look away. That boy carried the memory for the rest of his life, his will to resist broken before he ever had the chance to fight. Wives endured horrors of their own. Some were dragged to the execution grounds, bound in place, forced to watch as their husbands were smothered in carpets or strangled with rawhide. Their screams were drowned out by the laughter of Mongol generals, their tears ignored as hoofbeats shattered bone. For these women, survival meant living with the memory that the love of their life had been reduced to a spectacle of humiliation. This was cruelty with purpose. The Mongols understood that the pain of a single victim ended with death. But the pain inflicted on a family, the trauma carved into the minds of children, the despair etched into the hearts of widows, endured. It spread like a poison through households, villages, entire nations. Survivors became living monuments to Mongol power, their silence and obedience enforced by fear of reliving what they had witnessed. The ritual of forced witnessing became so ingrained in Mongol campaigns that it was almost administrative. Sons kneeling, wives screaming, brothers trembling, all bound by the same fate of seeing what no human should see. It was not enough for the victim to die. He had to die in front of those he loved most, turning affection into agony. In this way, Genghis Khan and his generals elevated cruelty into a multigenerational weapon. Entire bloodlines were psychologically broken. Entire communities were silenced by memories too horrific to speak aloud. The Mongols did not need to chain their captives. They chained their souls through trauma. This was terror perfected, not only the destruction of bodies, but the systematic annihilation of hope itself. For in the eyes of every son forced to watch his father's death, in the cries of every wife as her husband was crushed, the Mongols ensured that resistance would wither long before the next arrow flew. When the Mongols descended upon a city, they did not merely conquer it, they erased it. Resistance was answered not with defeat, but with annihilation. Entire populations, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were put to the sword in acts of violence so vast they ceased to be battles and became exterminations. The city of Nishapur stands as one of the most infamous examples. When a Mongol commander was killed during the siege, Genghis Khan's wrath fell not only upon the defenders but upon every man, woman, and child within the walls. Chronicles describe soldiers methodically cutting down the population until not a voice remained. Some accounts say over 700,000 people were slaughtered in a single campaign. It was not chaos. It was a system, each Mongol warrior ordered to execute hundreds, their grim work turning death into a bureaucratic task. What followed was a monument more terrible than any fortress: the Skull Pyramid. Carefully constructed, these were not random heaps of bones but deliberate towers, shaped to endure. From a distance, they looked like grim white mountains. Up close, they were mosaics of human faces bleached in the sun, silent screams frozen in death. They stood as eternal warnings. This is what resistance brings. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, met a similar fate in 1258. For centuries it had been a beacon of knowledge, a city of libraries, scholars, and faith. When the Mongols breached its walls, they reduced it to a charnel house. Estimates vary. Some say 200,000 died. Others speak of over 1 million, but all agree the devastation was absolute. Witnesses wrote that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of ruined manuscripts, then turned red with the blood of its people. Knowledge and life drowned together. The destruction was not blind fury. It was theater. By slaughtering entire populations, the Mongols sent a message that resonated across continents. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, heard the same refrain: resist, and you will vanish. Families burned alive in their sanctuaries, children buried beneath collapsing streets, survivors left only to tell tales that magnified the horror. What made these massacres so chilling was their precision. This was not the chaos of undisciplined troops. It was orchestrated cruelty, a policy designed to shape the future. Long after the fires burned out, the skull pyramids remained, towering testaments to a strategy that valued terror above mercy. In Nishapur, in Baghdad, and in countless other cities, death itself became a message written across the earth in bone and ash. And that message endured. Against the Mongols, resistance was not simply futile, it was suicidal. The Mongols knew that cities were not defended by walls alone. They were held together by faith, by temples, scriptures, rituals, and the hope that the divine would protect them. To destroy this belief was to destroy the very soul of resistance. And so, Genghis Khan and his generals wielded sacrilege as deliberately as they wielded their bows. In conquered Islamic cities, the Quran itself was not spared. Pages that had guided generations were torn apart, tossed into fires, or thrown beneath the hooves of horses. Imams were forced to stand powerless as sacred texts burned, their faces etched with despair. By violating what was untouchable, the Mongols sent a message that echoed louder than any trumpet. Even God's word could not shield you from Mongol wrath. Christian sanctuaries fared no better. In some places, churches that had once echoed with hymns were desecrated and turned into stables. Horses stood tethered where altars had once stood, the smell of dung replacing the scent of incense. Worshippers who had fled into their holy places, believing sanctuary would save them, were dragged out or trapped inside as flames consumed their last refuge. The lesson was brutal and clear. No cross, no prayer, no divine hand could intercede. Buddhist temples too became stages for Mongol cruelty. Towering statues of the Buddha, revered as symbols of peace and wisdom, were decapitated. Their heads were hurled like stones in siege warfare, turned into grotesque weapons. Monks who had pledged their lives to non-violence were sealed inside their temples, while smoke filled the chambers, suffocating them slowly over days. Their vows prevented them from lifting a weapon, and the Mongols exploited that faith to ensure their helpless deaths became another story of terror carried along the Silk Road. Even in China, the cultural heart of Confucian tradition, the Mongols sought to sever continuity. Examination halls that had chosen officials for centuries were dismantled, Confucian temples burned, and scholars humiliated. The fabric that bound generations was ripped apart, leaving the population unmoored, their intellectual guardians silenced. This was not random desecration. It was calculated psychological warfare. By trampling on the sacred, the Mongols demonstrated that nothing was beyond their reach. If the gods themselves could not protect their worshippers, what chance did mortals have? Faith, once a shield against despair, was twisted into despair itself. And so, with every Quran burned, every church defiled, every temple reduced to smoke, the Mongols did more than destroy buildings. They shattered the very idea of sanctuary. They proved that no place was holy, no faith strong enough, no heaven distant enough to escape the shadow of the Khan. The Mongols did not always need swords to kill. Sometimes they turned nature itself into their most merciless executioner. The deserts and winters of Eurasia were not obstacles to them. They were weapons. Under Genghis Khan, the earth, the sun, the ice, and the endless horizon became instruments of torture. One of the most terrifying punishments was burial in the sand. Prisoners were forced into shallow pits, buried up to their necks, left to the mercy of the blazing desert sun. Their faces, painted with blistering heat, twisted in agony as the hours dragged on. At night, predators circled. The half-buried victims could see the glowing eyes of wolves and jackals in the dark, but could not move. The Mongols sometimes filled entire fields with these grim monuments of heads protruding from the ground, forcing new captives to walk among them, a living forest of suffering. In the frozen north, the cruelty took another form. Naked prisoners were doused with buckets of water, their skin glistening for a moment before the bitter wind turned them into grotesque sculptures of ice. Rows of frozen figures stood in the snow, their faces locked in masks of terror. For the Mongols, this was more than punishment. It was spectacle. These human statues were displayed along the roads, warnings carved not in stone but in flesh, preserved by winter's grip. Then there were the death marches. Captives were tied together in long lines and driven across the steppe without food or water. The Mongols knew exactly how far the human body could be pushed, and they calculated these marches with chilling precision. Prisoners would collapse one by one, dragging the others down with them. Entire chains of captives would die within sight of water, their last hope taunting them just beyond reach. Nature itself was made complicit in the empire's cruelty. The sun blistered skin and blinded eyes. The cold cracked bones and turned breath to ice. Sandstorms scoured flesh raw, and desert nights gnawed at sanity. Death came slowly, as if the land itself bowed to the Khan's command. Witnesses carried these memories across continents. Traders whispered of men buried alive beneath the desert. Monks described frozen corpses standing like grotesque idols in the snow. Survivors who staggered away from death marches became walking ghosts, their hollow eyes spreading fear before Mongol banners even appeared on the horizon. In turning nature into their executioner, the Mongols revealed a mastery of cruelty that surpassed mere violence. The earth itself was made their ally, and the sky their accomplice. Resistance was not only against armies of men, but against the very elements of creation. And in that hopeless struggle, terror became eternal. For the Mongols, killing an enemy was often too merciful. True power lay not only in taking lives, but in destroying legacies. To strip a ruler of his dignity and parade him before his own people as a broken shell, that was a punishment more enduring than death. Under Genghis Khan, humiliation became a weapon sharpened with theatrical precision. Captured kings and generals were rarely allowed to die quickly. Instead, they were paraded through the very cities they once ruled, no longer exalted figures but living symbols of defeat. Some were forced to wear their crowns while dressed in rags, their once proud faces hollowed with shame. The same people who had once bowed before them now watched in silence, their faith in leadership shattered. The Mongols orchestrated these humiliations with cruel artistry. A general who had once commanded thousands might be ordered to sweep the floors of a stable. A king, his jeweled crown still balanced mockingly on his head, might be forced to shovel dung or feed livestock. The message was clear. Your glory means nothing. Your throne is dust, your power a joke. These spectacles were not hidden away. They were staged in public squares, before crowds compelled to watch. Citizens stood with expressions of shock and fear as their leaders bowed to beasts, their crowns gleaming in torchlight while their hands soiled with filth. It was theater of degradation, designed not only to shame the rulers but to break the spirit of the ruled. The cruelty cut deeper than execution. Death could make a martyr, but humiliation made a warning. No one would dare rise again when the price was not only blood, but dignity destroyed in the eyes of family, subjects, and history itself. Survivors carried the image of their kings debased into mockery, and that image did the work of 1,000 executions. Some accounts tell of nobles made to serve Mongol feasts, pouring wine for the very men who had slaughtered their armies. Others describe rulers shackled and forced to kneel as their crowns were turned into tools of ridicule. Every act reminded the world that under Mongol rule, nothing was sacred, not kingship, not pride, not human honor itself. In the end, this strategy was as effective as any massacre. By transforming emperors into servants and warriors into stable boys, Genghis Khan demonstrated that he did not just conquer lands, he conquered souls. For the Mongols, humiliation was conquest perfected, a cruelty that lingered long after the victims themselves were gone. The Mongols knew that steel and fire could destroy bodies, but the unseen could destroy entire civilizations. They understood that the most terrifying enemy is one you cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot escape. And so they weaponized disease, rumor, and despair with the same precision they used to aim an arrow. In their campaigns, corpses of the diseased were hurled over city walls or dumped into wells. The stench alone was enough to spread panic. But worse still was the knowledge that these bodies carried invisible killers. Long before the science of germs, the Mongols had learned that disease could travel faster than armies, rotting a city's will to resist before a single gate was breached. To drink water was to risk death. To breathe the air was to gamble with plague. Terror multiplied itself in silence. Even when the water was clean, rumor alone did the work. Mongol envoys whispered to besieged cities that wells had been poisoned. Families looked upon their pitchers with suspicion, each drop a possible executioner. The people, parched and desperate, often surrendered not because their bodies were weak, but because their minds had been broken. The psychological poison was as effective as any real one. Inside their prisons, the Mongols refined this cruelty even further. Captives were given impossible tasks. Count every grain of sand in a pile, remain motionless for days, complete absurd labors that no human could achieve. Each time they failed, they were promised another chance, and then another until hope itself became the torture. The cycle ground their spirit down until they stopped struggling, stopped resisting, and simply accepted despair. Others were subjected to randomness. A prisoner might be beaten one day, spared the next, punished again without reason. Patterns dissolved. The human instinct to make sense of suffering collapsed. In time, the victims no longer tried to avoid punishment. They resigned themselves to it, hollowed out and broken. Then they were released, not as men, but as carriers of despair, their haunted faces spreading terror wherever they went. The Mongols had discovered something chilling, that trauma could be a contagion. Survivors, often more frightening than corpses, carried the horror of what they had seen and endured into the hearts of others. They were the messengers of hopelessness, walking proofs that resistance was futile. In this way, the Mongols fought with weapons no army could parry. They mastered the invisible enemy, fear itself, and proved that the mind, once broken, is a battlefield far more devastating than any city of stone. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, but its shadow never faded. What Genghis Khan built was not only the largest contiguous empire in history, it was a template of terror so profound that nations still carry its scars centuries later. The true legacy of the Mongols was not measured in land, but in fear that survived long after their banners had vanished. In Russia, the Mongol yoke lasted for more than 200 years. Cities were sacked, princes humiliated, and entire generations raised under tribute to their conquerors. The memory of Mongol domination embedded itself into Russian governance, where autocracy and brutality became the tools of survival. From Ivan the Terrible to Stalin, echoes of Mongol methods, control through fear, obedience through violence, shaped a nation's soul. Historians argue that Russia's long dance with despotism can be traced back to the Tatar shadow, a political scar left by the Mongols' calculated cruelty. In China, the trauma took another form. After enduring Mongol conquest, the Ming dynasty rebuilt the Great Wall with renewed urgency. What had once been a series of crumbling fortifications became a colossal barrier stretching across the horizon. Each stone was a testament to fear, the memory of Mongol horsemen surging through the heart of China. Even the Forbidden City, with its multiple defensive layers, was designed not just as a palace but as a fortress against sudden conquest. Fear of the steppe forged architecture as much as it forged history. And in the modern world, the Mongol strategy of terror remains disturbingly familiar. Military theorists point to their tactics as the earliest example of shock and awe. The deliberate use of overwhelming, spectacular force to paralyze the enemy's will before the battle truly begins. The Mongols knew that terror was not simply an emotion but a weapon, one that could cripple armies, silence populations, and bend empires without endless bloodshed. Centuries later, modern armies still study their methods, proof that the legacy of Genghis Khan's cruelty outlived the empire itself. What makes this legacy most chilling is not the scale of Mongol violence, but its success. They proved that fear could be systematized, rationalized, and wielded with precision. They showed that terror could shape not just a battlefield, but entire civilizations. Russia's autocracy, China's Great Wall, the doctrine of shock and awe. All of these are monuments not only to Mongol conquest, but to the psychological scars they carved into humanity. The empire crumbled, but the fear remained. An invisible empire that endures, long after the last hoofbeat faded on the steppe.